everyone. I'm Jane Westman. I'm the programming chair of the Women's Media Group. I want to welcome you tonight to our program, which is going to be a fascinating conversation between Gail Papp and Rose Styron. It will be moderated by our Women's Media Group member, Bridget Marmion. Welcome. Just let me say a few words about this wonderful organization, the Women's Media Group. We are a non-profit organization based in New York City. Our members have all reached a level of prominence in the media, whether that's book publishing, magazines, newspapers, radio, television, podcasting, and other types of modern online media. We meet to learn from each other, support each other, help each other through our programming and through our networking. We also have a very vibrant program to support young women who want to grow their careers in the media. We provide mentoring, and we even have a scholarship program for them. If you'd like to learn more, please go to womensmediagroup.org. I welcome you all. It's going to be a great program, and I'm turning it over to Bridget. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks all so much, and thanks for joining us tonight on a drizzly night in New York. I hope the weather's better where you are, but no matter where, I hope this brightens your evening. So yeah, I'm Bridget Marmion, and I've spent over a decade at Farris Josh Giroux at Random House in Houghton Mifflin, and then launched my own firm, Bridget Marmion Book Marketing, a decade ago. And I've got the extraordinary pleasure tonight to moderate the conversation between these two luminaries, but not until I take care of some housekeeping. And that's simply to let you know that the event tonight will be a conversation between Rose and Gail and myself. So that'll be for the next half hour or so. And I will be asking Rose and Gail a series of questions. So I ask you, please, if you've got questions, to put them in the chat. And then at the end of our program, our conversation, we'll address the questions that you guys had. I'm working with my WMG colleagues, Women's Media Group colleagues, Carol Honig and Jane Westman. We're pleased, I have to say dazzled. I'm pretty impressed. I'm pretty excited to introduce you to two of the most accomplished and impressive women in, I would say, the most accomplished people in American culture. Gail Merrifield Papp and Rose Styron are both activists and incredibly creative and incredibly accomplished in different fields, and that's not all they have in common. Gail Merrifield Papp joined Joseph Papp's New York Shakespeare Festival in 1965 and became director of new works development for the public theater, working alongside Joe to create a new kind of theater. Gail was responsible for actually some of the public's best remembered plays and productions, including The Normal Heart and The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Partners in both work and life, Gail Merrifield and Joe Papp were married in 1976. And Rose Styron is a poet, a journalist, international human rights activist, and a founding member of Amnesty International USA. She's also the discoverer of Philip Roth, as well as the longtime wife of author William Styron, whose work includes many American classics, and I can't not mention Sophie's Choice and Darkness Visible. So we're together tonight to talk about memoirs from the lives that inspired them. So could I have the first slide, please? Beyond This Harbor. Beyond This Harbor by Rose Styron was published in June of this year. So many of you may not have had the pleasure yet. Next slide, please. So you can see how just two examples of what the response has been. These are from the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal. And I read a number of responses, and the basic message is exactly the same. This is a book you're really going to enjoy. So I encourage you to take a look at Beyond This Harbor. And the other memoir we can celebrate tonight is called Public Private: My Life with Joe Papp at the Public Theater by Gail Merrifield Papp. And that's not yet published. It'll be published in October. And in addition to great stories, it's also full of marvelous photos. And on the next slide, you're going to see a special offer. I'm sorry, yes, a special offer from the publisher, but I encourage everybody to order Public Private from the bookseller of your choice. And I'm going to ask Travis, please, to put this special offer from the publisher of Applause Books into the chat so that you don't have to write so quickly. So now on to the main event, which of course is meant to be a somewhat casual, but I hope informative conversation with these two extraordinary women. And I'm very happy to say that some of these questions are actually offered up by Gail or by Rose, and I'm really grateful for that. And I'm going to start with one we couldn't resist. You're both incredibly accomplished women who also each had long marriages to legendary men, to author Bill Styron and to Joseph Papp, theatrical producer and director. I have to imagine that was both thrilling and challenging. So would you like to comment, or may I ask you to comment? I'm going to ask you first, Rose, to comment on your own work in relationship to your husband's work.
Well, we had a very romantic, fun beginning, and we got married in Rome. I think there's a picture of that you have.
Yes.
And when we moved to Roxbury, then we began writing in earnest. Neither of us did in Rome or at our 9-month honeymoon in Ravello or in Paris with the Paris Review. But when we settled in Roxbury, then I think there's a picture of that too.
There's your family.
There's with my 4 children and one of our many dogs. We had an absolutely wonderful country life, and we wrote separately. I wrote poetry. Bill wrote his novels. I didn't read my poetry to Bill because he was so concerned and involved with his own, and we would discuss the 1 or 2 or 3 pages he wrote every night. We discussed it after dinner, and I type it in the morning with my 2 fingers. And then I had 4 children, and I had the most amazing, wonderful second childhood with them. And I kept on writing poetry, but I put it in the drawer. So we had separate writing lives until I began to publish. I published a children's book first with my kids in mind, and then after a few years of putting it in the drawer, began to publish 3 other books.
And wonderful books they are. Gail, I wonder if I could ask you to speak a little bit about your work in relation to Joe's.
Well, in my case, my work was not separate from Joe's because I worked for the nonprofit theatrical organization that he founded. So, and I totally supported his egalitarian philosophy in the theater, which really pioneered the path for a certain kind of casting that made Shakespeare available to all actors, including Black and Hispanic actors, where he made talent the only criteria that applied to an audition or the consideration of an actor. This is Joe and me walking. We're in front of the public theater there, and we're walking home in let's see, what is this? This is 1973. And Joe's toting his briefcase, and I've got a shoulder bag of play scripts to read on my shoulder. There wasn't too much separation between our working and home life. The home was sort of an extension of the work at the public theater. And we liked it that way. That truly worked out for us. We did have a home life. Joe's youngest son lived with us, and his daughter, who lived in New York, came and stayed with us from time to time. But the fact that I worked in his organization meant that we shared the same kind of viewpoint about the theater. And in terms of that, it grew into what I would call an artistic partnership. And it was only after about a decade of that kind of equation that we were finally married. And I found that Joe was always supportive of my work with new writers, which was my job. And he was never resentful of it, competitive with it in any way whatsoever. And I have to point out that he was like that in general. He was someone who really and truly wanted to encourage and support the development of other people's talents and abilities. He never had any kind of issue with feeling threatened or unhappy about them, because he felt when they thrived, he and the theater thrived. So that was really a remarkable quality that Joe had. Everybody who was ever around him felt it very, very profoundly. And certainly I did. So that was how we worked together, essentially.
And I've had the privilege, not all of you have had the privilege to read both Gail and Rose's books. And the one further comment I want to offer, which you'll see when you read Public Private, is that in addition to that natural generosity, it also translated into an incredible leadership. Because when I was reading Public Private, what I loved, because Gail is really at heart an editor. I mean, she made plays from too many pages into amazing works of art. But when you're reading about Joe in the process, his philosophy, I may not get the words right, Gail, but his philosophy was that the work is the artist. You know, it's not him. He always made sure that the playwright and that they realized that they were working with the creation of the playwright. So it was that generosity and that acknowledgement of the writer at the core of it that made me fall in love with Joe Papp as I was reading your book, and I've admitted that before.
Yes, you have.
So I'm going to move on to question number 2, which is kind of a hard one, but I know it's probably on a lot of people's minds, so I thought we'd address it right away, which is that because your very, very busy lives were so entwined, and even though you were traveling so enormously, Rose, across the country, across the world, as an activist, there was so much else going on. But I do have to ask what it was like before and after you lost Bill. Would you care to say anything about that?
Well, it was a wonderful double full life for the two of us before he died. We shared activism. If I went traveling around the world for Amnesty to see what disasters were going on personally around the world, I would come home. Bill was perfectly encouraging and happy to have me go because he liked to be alone to write. And then he often wrote to promote the human rights material that I brought home. So he was always welcoming for that. And of course, that didn't start till our youngest child, who was 13 years younger than the oldest, was in first or second grade. I stayed home until then and then started traveling. But we were very close through wonderful times and then through the very hard times of his two depressions. But boy, do I still miss him. It's been quite a while, and I don't think I'll ever get over my wonderful life with Bill.
And thank you for the book you created and shared with us, Fierce Days, which was written, I think, to help you, or well, because you're creative and you have to write. But it's a wonderful book to encourage other people to who are grieving.
Well,
And I bet you describe it much more eloquently, but that's because you are who you are and I'm who I am. But congratulations.
well, I describe better in poetry than I do in prose. But I was a journalist as well as a poet, but I certainly never looked back to write a memoir. And I guess I don't express myself very well in that department publicly.
The people who read your book feel differently. But Gail, I wonder if you would be willing to comment on
Yeah.
life.
Well, I understand what Rose just said. With respect to my life with Joe, it was rewarding because it was in service of a mutually shared idea, and it was an immensely rewarding kind of life. After Joe died, I immediately realized that the new leadership at the theater would want to have their own people there, especially in the artistic area, which is where I was working. Therefore, I decided that I would resign from the public theater, and so I left it. I still believe it was the correct decision. It would have been very wrong if I'd tried to sort of hang on. I knew that would be absolutely wrong. So I never regretted that. But at the time, that decision was very painful. And I really didn't know what to do with myself. I wasn't a writer, and I didn't have any other occupation or profession to turn to. So it was very difficult until I finally did start writing, but that took me quite a while to get there.
Well, I started writing very differently after Bill died, and I had to decided to give up our big country place where we lived for 50 years. And I was teaching at Harvard for a couple of years and then moved full-time to Martha's Vineyard, where Bill actually died and is buried. So the memories of him are now vineyard memories, and that has been both enhanced and replaced by all my old and new vineyard friendships.
Mm-hmm. And when did you actually start writing, Rose? I mean, in the very beginning, a third grade teacher, I think, has something to do with this.
Yeah, I started writing in third grade, but in fourth grade, my teacher, who thought I was very naughty, accused me of plagiarism when a long poem that I had written about wishing I lived in Africa with those children and all their animals that we were studying about in geography. And it was a long rhymed ditty, and it was published in the Friend School's high school magazine. And I was accused of plagiarism by my teacher. She called me up in front of the class, and none of us knew what plagiarism was, of course. She said, you got this from somewhere and put your name on it. Shame on you. So when I found out what plagiarism was, I thought, oh, if somebody thinks a high school person or a college person wrote my poem, maybe I can be a poet. So I really started writing then, and I have reams of rhymed verse, I would say, sometimes, and they turned into poetry by high school.
That's so interesting, because I was accused of plagiarism also in the 6th grade, because I'd written a little play about the Chinese emperor Shi Huangti, who burned all the books. And so that really struck home with me, because my parents were both writers and editors. And I thought, my God, this guy way back then burned these books. So I wrote a little play about it, and I submitted it as part of an assignment to the teacher. And she accused me of plagiarism. She said that I'd stolen it from someone. I was just flabbergasted. But like you, I learned what the word meant from that experience, and I was very hurt by it. My parents helped me to kind of try to toss it off. They thought it was outrageous. They told me, she had no business saying something like that to me. And but nevertheless, I'd always been writing when I was a little kid. I wrote little stories. I sent them to little author columns at the San Francisco Bay Area, where I grew up. And I published a little newspaper. I had a little literary journal. I hectographed them. They were 2 pages long each, and I hectographed them when I was in school. And for my parents, I just have to acknowledge briefly, I really did develop a great love of words and a reverence for their use. So this is a letter writing age when I was growing up, I thought of letters as occasions for the kind of a composition, to write a composition, which would be a letter that you might send to somebody. So those kinds of feelings about words and writing started very young with me, although I didn't become a writer in my youth.
Well, I think this night might have to be a mini series, because I want to start a whole other conversation about when Gail Papp realized she was actually an editor, and because not only the formation of an editor, but also the role of editors is something that makes my heart sing as a publishing lifer. So park that idea. We're going to come back to that. But meanwhile, now that you are both writing and creating in different ways, I'm going to ask you how you do relate writing about the past to the present time. And I'm going to ask you in the context, I suppose, both of your memoir and any other way you want to respond to that. So Gail, I wonder what you think about that question.
Well, I relate the past to the present very strongly, because I think a knowledge of the past can yield some examples and lessons that are very important for us to know about as we try to navigate our contemporary scene, which is very, very challenging in many, many ways. So I think that Joe's activism was quite instructive to me. And I think you've got a slide somewhere about this, where this is when, this is in 1982, during what was later called the Great Massacre of 1982 on Broadway, because 5 theaters were threatened with demolition, including 2 gems of theaters, one of which was called the Morosco Theater, which had absolutely irreplaceable natural acoustics, and it was also beautifully designed at the beginning of the 20th century. So these theaters were threatened with demolition. And so Joe conducted protests on the street for almost 2 weeks, where New Yorkers, the hundreds, turned out every day, representing the theatrical communities, cultural organizations, a League of Architects, trying to persuade the city and the real estate interests in this scene to build over the beautiful Morosco Theater. This was kind of a last ditch stance. And in this case, the activism, which was remarkable, did not succeed. So a wrecking machine finally bit into the beautiful Morosco Theater and it came crashing down. But many people wrote about it, and the fact that it got dubbed the massacre of 1982 went viral in the media, including television. And I think the ultimate result of all of that, even though it failed, was to hinder and curtail any future depredations on the theatrical, cultural history and buildings in the city. So that was probably an outcome of it. And from that, I get a lesson that if you speak out and you demonstrate, even if you don't succeed, there is some lasting value to it. And I think that's something we can all relate to, no matter what era we come from or what immediate problems we see around us. So I take enormous heart from that, and I still believe in it. And it was one of the things that I connected so strongly to at the theater, and also because of the way Joe was. Joe was what I would call a pragmatic radical. He was an egalitarian and a pragmatic radical. He did not like to be called a liberal because he thought liberals had their feet up in the midair and he didn't know where the heck they were. But he was always on the side of people who wanted their rights represented. He always felt he was on that side of the fence. And he was a very strong person in his expression of his love of democracy, not as a Democrat necessarily, although he was one, but for democracy. And it may be hard for younger people now to associate themselves with that sort of feeling. I grew up with it because I grew up as a child, I was in World War II, and which is the Roosevelt era. And I had very strong feelings about democracy myself, even as a young child. So Joe was a slightly older than myself, remember them from a different decade, essentially. But that was part of our connection, I think. So we remember this era where you could talk about democratic values, and it wasn't a huge political battle that you found yourself in the midst of, because everybody felt patriotic, definitely a sense of patriotism about the country, and considerable pride despite its many faults, and a love of country and a love of the things that brought people together in that feeling about where they were living and growing up in. I hope that isn't lost forever, but right now it certainly doesn't exist very much.
Wow, I would like to echo everything that Gail said so much better than I can say it. I also grew up as a child in World War II. I was brought up by the Quakers for my 13 years in Friends School. And although we were taught to be pacifists, the school cheered all our military graduates who were doing a fabulous job. And by the time I got to Rome and met Bill, I found out we were equal activists. We were both fighting against the death penalty, which still hasn't been solved, but I've been working against that all my life since, and against prisons. I've been writing a letter this week in defense of Leonard Peltier, the Native American who has been held in jail by the FBI for 47 years, even though he was declared innocent of shooting an FBI man on the Native American reservation he was such a leader of. And I've brought the past back with me politically, as well as socially, and as well as with my family. My 4 amazing kids are all good activists also. And so I share, though I can't express it as well as Gail did, not Yale. That's where my son teaches. But I have those feelings still that I've brought from the past into the present, and hope I won't ever lose. Bill and I got together through that kind of activism, as well as singing and writing and traveling with the Paris Review, well, for the last 70 years.
Yeah.
And as I read both the memoirs, but commenting on Rose's right now, and especially as you were traveling for Amnesty, I wish I could say that that seemed like the very far past, but it doesn't. The country names may have changed, not always, but the fight continues. And both of you, I've been privileged to have conversations with each of you, and you've expressed, this next generation, we're not going to ask them to fix it for us. I'm the one saying that, but to keep the fight going. And reading the accounts of yours, the kind of activism both of you are still involved in, is what's inspiring, because it's not that you felt something should be done. You did it, and you knew how to organize, you knew how to get it done. And so I'm just hoping that, this next generation and people our age, all of our age, continue to benefit from the fire in your bellies. As necessary now as it was when some of the stories you're telling in your memoirs.
Absolutely.
So now I'm going to ask the question everybody seems to have to be asked, which is, why did you decide to write a memoir? So, actually, I'm going to start with Gail this time. I'm trying to be fair here.
You asked me, I'm
yeah.
sorry, which of us is?
I'm going to ask Gail. Oh, just because I slur my words, that's a problem. I'm going to ask Gail.
I didn't say Rose. I don't know.
Okay,
Why did I
over? Gail, may I ask you to comment on why
did I write a memoir? Well, the most honest answer, first, is because I missed him so much. And the second part was that in the years immediately after Joe died, I was asked to be what's called a research collaborator on 3 different projects. There were 2 published books and a documentary film about him. And I was persuaded to be the research collaborator to the people that created these projects. So what I had to do was write many memos and background descriptions of the plays, people, and politics of Joe's life, which I did. And I found that the process of writing them for these other people's work brought me back to reliving some of the things that I had shared with Joe during our years together. And I thought that was interesting, and possibly I would write more about that. And but what happened was that I couldn't write about Joe without writing about his activism and his philosophy and the complexities of his personality. And so I felt when I tried to do that, by its very nature, it had to be more than my reminiscences, because it took me into these other areas that we were both so engaged in. And so I felt, well, this is kind of changing a little bit for me. And what I want to do more than just remember him. I want to kind of create a sense of him that others can also appreciate and maybe get some value from. And so that expanded yet again to the idea it's a memoir, not just for my own reminiscences, but for some purpose that was larger than that I hoped people might find in what I wrote about our life together and him, that would give them some kind of encouragement and hope about the present. So it was like a long kind of process that I didn't expect to come out that way exactly. But that became my primary motivation finally in doing it. And I find actually it's now my motivation in even talking about it. It's not fond and interesting past reminiscences about a fruitful life. It's something a little different. And I don't regret that at all. I feel good about it.
The conversation that's got to be had. And Rose, I wonder if you'd like to comment a little bit about why you decided to write a memoir.
I think it was very different from the way Gail decided. I had said I would never look past and would never write about the past, that I would only write about the present and look into the future as best I could with my writing and my caring and writing in the shadow of my wonderful family and my great husband, who was not only a terrific writer, he was a wonderful human being, an activist himself, and a fabulous host and amusing companion and loving travel if it was safe and he could tell what was going to happen first. He didn't like anything he couldn't see exactly in the future or any change. But we had such a fabulous time together that I had never actually thought of writing a memoir the way I did years and years ago when we were much younger. Jackie Kennedy, who was an editor at the time, I think at Doubleday, asked me to write one. And I said, oh, no, I never look back. And she asked what I was writing at the moment. And I told her that I was writing briefly about political prisoners I had known who came out to lead their countries. And I wanted to have a long essay on the moments when they were in prison that they felt they could come out and change their country for the better, which they did. And so Jackie, we were having a last picnic on one of a strange beach, actually, on Martha's Vineyard before we went home the next day, said, well, you write that and we'll meet here again next summer, next June, when I come up to the vineyard and you do, and show me what you've done, or come see me in New York. But she died before I could do that, and I abandoned that idea. But the reason I started writing this memoir, Beyond This Harbor, many years later, was because an editor from Knopf, Vicki Wilson, who I had just met on my porch with a friend, asked me to. And although I said, I doubt it, I never look back. I only look forward and plan forward and think about the moment. I did think about it and took some notes. And when COVID happened the very next year, I accepted her offer and began to scribble. And I really scribbled with no ideas at all. I took one of my husband's old yellow lined pads that he wrote with such beautiful script, not like mine, and just to see what would come out. And I think I'm left-handed, and I think the left hand was connected to somewhere in my brain. I don't know where, but I started writing, and so many memories came back that made me happy, that intrigued me and kept me company. I remembered a lot from ages 1 to 6, which really surprised me. And then from 6 on, a very rich, fun, lucky life emerged. And I just kept writing and writing in no special order, with nothing special in mind. And it kept me company during COVID, which was pretty lonely here on the island. We never entertained inside. I would meet a friend or two, or my Scrabble players, weekly on the porch, and we were bundled up so you wouldn't recognize us. But there wasn't a whole lot of company. And oddly enough, it amused me and made me learn a lot about myself I had never thought of, because I'd always been an athlete and a traveler and having fun with my husband, or being very concerned with his trials, and hadn't looked back. And suddenly there it was, much too much of it. And my editor judiciously cut things out, and I cut things out. And there you have it.
Well, you've both already touched a little bit on my next question, but because I know we have a lot of writers in our audience, I'm going to ask you specifically. How did you confront some of the issues that every writer faces? The one I have to ask first about, the blank page. You know, when you decide somewhere on some level you are going to commit and do it. So how do you face the blank page? Any advice or tips you have over that? And I'm going to ask Rose with any tips there, and also finding the time and the psychic space to write. So do you have any comments on that, or suggestions for writers who are thinking of writing themselves a memoir?
Well, I think I was particularly lucky, in memoir language, that I lived alone here. And so I had lots of time. I'm not recommending that. I'm recommending to take a big pad of paper and a pen to bed with you writers, because that's what I do. And when I wake up at odd moments at night, I make notes. And when I get up in the morning, then I would start to write before I have to face all the pleasures and trials of the day.
Very specific. And Gail, how about you, dear?
Well, you mentioned the blank page phenomenon. When I started to write many years ago, the memoir, which I'd had in mind, I was suddenly seized with the inability to inhabit my own experiences. It was like the sudden onset of a disease, and I was sort of stunned by it, but I couldn't write a word. I just could not write a word. I felt that I really didn't have anything to say. Fortunately, one weekend, a friend of mine who's a professional writer was staying with me, and I told her about the problem. And she wasn't particularly upset about it because she taught writing classes. So she said, well, it was the evening, and she said, well, you know, what you need to do, you sit down in that chair in front of, it was then a typewriter, it wasn't a computer. Sit down in front of your typewriter, she said, and don't get up from the chair until you've written a few sentences. I was just trying to write a preface, but I couldn't even write that. So I, dutifully sat down in the chair and I didn't get up. Well, hours went by and just nothing came from my brain to my hand to the page. And I was getting awfully desperate. And I think at one point I actually cried, but I faithfully kept sitting in the chair. And so much time went by. I thought, this is really embarrassing. And I just really felt desperate. I mean, we'll both have to go to bed at some point. I mean, what the hell am I going to do about this? And I felt I've been through a lot of psychological experience, my past, so I'm aware of the psychology of various things. That, well, this must be some kind of goddamn block, but I didn't expect it. And then finally, I just felt, well, we do have to go to bed, and I've got to write some sentences. She told me to write a few sentences. I'll write 5 sentences. So I wrote 5 sentences, and I read them out loud to her. She said, okay. She said, now write a few more. I said, oh my God, no. But I did. And that horrible and painful and god-awful experience somehow got the problem I had unstuck. And the words started to come out. And I finally was able to write about my own past, which I just hadn't been able to do before. I don't know what's behind this kind of block that writers have. With me, it was like the sudden onset of some kind of like physical disability. I couldn't put my hands on the keyboard, and that my brain couldn't work properly. But it was very dramatic, and I did get past that. And so I was very grateful to her that she'd helped me get unstuck. Fortunately, she was apparently familiar with it. I don't know whether it was from her own experience or not, but certainly through writing classes, she had found that in some of her students and colleagues. So she kind of knew what to do, which is not terribly complicated. It really is literally not getting up from the damn chair until you've written a few sentences. That was it.
Well, I've got to say, on behalf of all the writers out there, and first I'll quote Jonathan Galassi, who most of you probably know is the editor-in-chief or whatever of Farrar Straus, writers are the bravest among us. And the reason that resonated with me right away is that what Gail just described and what rose before her is something that's so familiar to writers, those obstacles. And you'll all have your own reasons for your block. I'm not good enough. I don't have anything interesting enough to say. What's so-and-so going to think about this? There's a million different things. But I hope what you just heard over the last few minutes is enough to, first of all, make it very clear that you're not alone. Virtually every writer, my own son wrote a book last year. And yes, it's torture to write a book. I'll say it out loud. As much as I love publishing, I have to acknowledge that. So I'm just hope everyone heard loud and clear that even these incredibly brave, very accomplished women had the same obstacle you had. Sit down and write 5 sentences to start.
Don't you wish we each had a map of our brains to find out which portions store what and why?
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
do. And I always wondered, people ask me why I remember, like Amnesty trips in such detail. And I think it's because I was never permitted by Amnesty to write anything down in case I got caught. So it was all stored somewhere in my brain, what I had to remember. And why I remember the other wonderful stuff is the emotions that reoccur. So it keeps one company.
And actually, that is one of the things we were going to ask is how do you keep the details right about events and conversations that took place so long ago? And as you just said, Rose, and as you said in your book, because of your, I don't know if it was training with Amnesty or somebody simply said you can't write it down and you had to teach yourself how to have this voluminous memory because people's lives depended on it, literally.
Yeah. And it's fun to think about when you were very young that you decided to live by the sea. Ooh, sorry. That I remembered suddenly why I decided to live by the sea when I was 6 in Atlantic City. And that followed me all my life. And I never thought about that.
And how about you, Gail?
Like I said, I was very lucky because there were several decades of written play reports, memos, correspondence, Joe's interviews, both in print and taped, correspondence. It was a vast archive that the Public Theater had saved, which I had access to. So I was able to fact check just about everything I wrote about in my book. When it came to conversations that I quote in the book, since Joe often spoke what he'd written or had conveyed in an interview, I was able to kind of reconstruct some conversations that I wanted to represent in the book. And they're pretty authentic because they are his words and the way he expressed himself. So I was lucky in that respect. And I also had these fabulous records that were kept by some of his assistants and people I refer to as chief of staff at his organization that could tell me, for instance, from the casting department, which wonderful actors had gotten in their early start at the Public in which plays and what roles they played. And also when certain playwrights had first come into our theater. And so all of that was very lucky that I could actually document it. Otherwise, it could be kind of a little fuzzy. It could be off by 5 or 2 or 1 year, it's not so good.
And you also, of course, had so many visual prompts, given the world that you live in, with the not just movie posters, but so much press about the whether it was Hair on Broadway or Hamilton and everything in between. So you also had that, I'm sure, to prompt your own personal memories. And actually, we do have an image. Can we see slide number 8, please, Travis? Because I'm just going to ask Rose what kind of memories this brought up. And then Gail might want to make a comment too.
Oh my goodness, where did you find that picture?
Yes,
That was Rome, 1953, a long time ago, with all my Paris Review friends and my brother and his wife and the mayor of Rome who married us. And the only English words he had afterwards to each of us as he shook our hands was, "I hope you will come to my movie theaters. I hope you will come to my movie theaters." So he would have loved Joe Papp.
And you kind of buried your lead, but yes, if you didn't catch it, this is the wedding picture of Rose and William Styron.
I'm sorry, was that a question?
No, I'm just letting everybody, I'm stating, in case it's not obvious, this is in fact your wedding picture.
It is, in fact, our wedding picture in Rome at the Campidoglio. There are best man, Bobby White, whose grandfather built the Academy in Rome, American Academy in Rome, where we all lived or lived nearby, and other writers there and musicians and so forth. I won't go naming everybody.
Well, it's a very rich part of
Had
the
a
book.
wonderful, wonderful time. All our Paris Review friends came because Edwin, the writer who was sort of the godfather of the Paris Review, had moved to Rome and gave us our wedding party. And he telegrammed Peter Matheson and George Plimpton and other Paris Review workers saying, "You have to come to Rose and Bill's wedding in Rome. After all, a guy only gets married 2 or 3 times in his life." So lots of them came, and that was fun.
Very thoughtful of him. So did I interrupt you before, Gail? Did you want to make another comment?
No.
Well, now my next question is, and I think I'm going to start by asking Gail first. Art, performances, and certainly even social events can have consequences and impact sometimes far beyond what we imagine or expect. I made this tough for everybody. I asked each of my guests to, when I make that comment of work you've created, whether it's a performance or a book or a social event that triggered change or had impact beyond what you thought, what pops into your head? So Gail, is it fair of me to ask you that?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that pops into my brain, of course, is Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart, which he wrote at the peak of the AIDS crisis in the mid-'80s in New York City. And this play has become, famous. But in the mid-'80s, it had been rejected all over the place. And by directors, producers, and so forth, it had no luck in getting anybody to even read it. So he came by the public theater with his manuscript and didn't leave it with me. He left it with the young man you saw in one of those pictures there, Emmett Foster, who was at the Morosco protest with us. And he asked Emmett to get it to Joe. He didn't want anybody to read it except Joe. So Emmett said, "Well, that's not how things work. Mr. Papp's not going to read this unless, somebody tells him to read it. It's, he's going to listen to," so forth and so on. So there was a lot of kind of preliminary about the submission of The Normal Heart. Finally, it got to our literary manager, who worked very closely with me, and he'd read it, and then he brought it to me one day, and he said, "Well, this is a 300-page play." Can you believe that? It would take 10 hours to perform. It's impossible. He's got all these statistics, medical statistics in this play that, how do you do that on the stage? They don't have any dramatic reason necessarily, but there are little bits of gold here, little gold nuggets here and there in the script that are really interesting. And he said, I think you should read it. So I admired Bill Hart, was a literary manager, immensely, and respected him. So I read the play. It was 300 pages, 300 pounds. It was huge. It's like this. And by the time I got to the end of it, I'd seen all the nuggets. I recognized them. And I was also deeply moved by it. So I thought, okay, I'll call the author and we'll meet. So I called Larry Kramer and I said, I read your play and I'd love to talk to you about it. Excuse me. So he came with his dog. He had a lovely dog. And the dog immediately went to sleep under his chair in my office. And so I started telling Larry all the things that I liked so much in his play, which was his biblical rage about the fact that no one was paying any attention to this horrendous crisis, not on a state, city, or federal level. Nobody was speaking about it. And so I responded to that. He compared it to the Holocaust. And so and when the play, took fire, it really took fire. It was powerfully expressed. The other parts of it were very clunky. And so this first meeting, I asked Larry, I said, there's one thing, this character, I didn't quite understand what this character was saying here, whatever it was I said to him. All of a sudden, he got very energetic. He said, yes. And he whipped out a yellow pad from his briefcase. He says, that's the reason for that problem is because that's a composite character. Well, I had no idea what he meant by that. But he'd use real life people as models for the characters in the play. And he apparently combined two of these models into one. And he immediately understood why it hadn't worked and why, therefore, I'd had a problem. So he came back the next week with rewrites that I hadn't even asked for. And we developed this relationship based on his wanting to come every week, to see me every week with his dog. And he started to work on it. But he was always complaining. He said, why won't you give this to Joe? Well, it was still enormous. It was still a mess and so forth and so on. So I was in a peculiar position because I fully understood I was the gatekeeper and the gateway to access to Joe, the producer, who could actually do it. I understood that. But I also knew very well what Joe would read and what he wouldn't read. He wouldn't read something that was 200 pages long. It was designed for the theater unless he had some remarkable recommendation that came with it. So I kept asking Larry questions. That was my way of handling that. And he was very happy to write answers to them and then make a little modification. Then one week he came in and he said, okay, he says, great news. He says, I've gotten rid of all of that secondary plot. I'm going to make another play of it. It's all out. And I said, really? He said, yes. So he handed me a new script that was like half the size. And I read it and I thought, okay, I can give this to Joe. And then I had the problem of getting Joe to read the script. Interestingly enough, for someone who did so many new plays, he was always initially very resistant to picking up anything to read, although he read a great deal, because what it would mean if he liked it, he would have to then produce it and get into all the difficulties, the expense, the money, the situation, a whole smorgasbord of difficulties of producing anything. And he didn't really want to do that all the time. He wasn't really always open to it. So I said, yes, but I said, I brought it home. I put it on the table. I said, I just left it there. I said, you should really just take a look at it. Well, a week went by and he didn't touch it. And then finally, the second week, he picked it up. He read the first 10 pages. He said, Gail, this is the worst thing I've ever read, for God's sake. I said, I know, because there's a lot of clunky stuff, still in it. I couldn't go. So I said, I don't want to just go read on a little bit, you'll see it has something. So we did read on a little bit. And this, of course, my position, I'm working with him, for him, I'm also his wife, and so forth. I had no special charm as far as the worthiness of a play was concerned. With Joe, I had the same, disability that anybody else would have in trying to get him to read something and listen to your recommendation. The same standards applied to me as applied to anybody else. So he finally did get through it, and he had the same reaction that I had to this new version. He was deeply moved by it. So he called Larry into his office and he said, I'll produce it. So this play, when it was done, had an enormous impact because it represented the lives of so many people at that time who were being ignored. And it had a very fine cast and a wonderful director. So when it opened, we all assembled in the green room to listen to Joe read the review out loud. And the review was picky and picayune and strange in its kind of distance from the urgency of the play. So we were all crestfallen, but Joe said, well, I'm going to run this play as long as I possibly can because it's so important. And something like this only comes along once in a decade, even that. So it ran, it had a tremendous following in terms of an audience, and it became the longest running play in the public theater's history. It also then had 600 productions around the world in many, many different countries and many different languages. So that changed the public theater in many ways. And it was especially important change in the mid-'80s because this was the era of when a conservative administration had come into play, the head of our country. And everything was kind of flattened out for a while in terms of playwriting. It became rather minuscule and inconsequential in some respects. So it was a wonderful social and artistic breakthrough in a way for all of us. The other play, I don't want to go on too long, but the other play I have to mention, because it's also very close to my heart, was for colored girls who considered suicide when the rainbow was enough by Ntozake Shange. This had started in humble bars and small theaters, way off Broadway, off Broadway. And a former stage manager at the public theater who became a director knew about it and brought it to us and said, well, here it is. Well, I looked at the thing. It was very remarkable poetry, but it was all poetry. And I didn't really see the dramatic construction of it right off the bat, but this director said, oh no, he said, well, you really have to see it and hear it. You can't just read it. I said, okay. So we arranged for the cast of 7 women to perform it for us one afternoon and in one of our theaters. And it was just one of the most major experiences I ever had in my entire life. It was brilliant, eloquent, angry, funny, beautiful. It was so many things. And at first, since this was a time when there was a lot of sensitivity about appropriation of culture going on, so I was somewhat sensitive about my reaction to its superb poetic expression. But and I realized what I'd reacted to was its universal qualities. It was universal, just like anything you think is great is universal. Doesn't matter where it comes from. You can read War and Peace, that's Russian, and it's 400 years old or whatever. Shakespeare is 400. It doesn't matter. It's universal. So I finally understood that this is a universal experience I'm having, and I got beyond my overly sensitive ruminations about why I reacted so strongly to it. But I did react that strongly to it, and I still have that feeling about that work. It just was a total revelation, a powerful and beautiful one for me. So Joe produced Zaki's play, which he called a choreo poem, at the public, and it became the most unexpected and unanticipated hit in any of our experiences. It became a hit, you can imagine. A series of narrative poems became a hit show. This is just extraordinary. And it moved to Broadway yet, and it ran there very successfully. And it's still revived all over the world, as a matter of fact, now. So, and it was an expression of a group of Black women about their experience in this country that resonated everywhere. Similar to another playwright we did, George C. Wolfe, with his Colored Museum. It was done in Poland in Polish by a Caucasian cast, and it had tremendous resonance for that audience in that place. So you never know. You just never know what's going to go off in this kind of huge universal frame of reference for people here at home and in other cultures. But these two plays certainly did it.
Absolutely, and they continue to, as we all know. But Rose, I have to ask you, what did you think of when I asked you to talk about an event that you were part of that had consequences or impact far beyond what you expected? And I think we have a photo if you'd like to show him.
I'll give you two, just because I was listening carefully to Gail, and I thought about Bill Styron's two novels which had public consequences. The Confessions of Nat Turner, consequences private and public for him, and Sophie's Choice, which was the only novel that I had a real input into, because he read me his first chapter, which was written about a woman he admired who lived upstairs from him in his boarding house when he had graduated from college and started writing. And the chapter he read me was of Sophie's choice between her two children, which is just mesmerizing and heartbreaking. And I said, it's a great chapter, Bill. If that's your first chapter, there's not another mother and maybe not another woman in the world who's going to read chapter 2. So why don't you save that? Mm-hmm. And I think the only other public thing of consequence was a dinner party we had, which we thought was going to be purely social, because we had welcomed our Latin friend, Carlos Fuentes and his family, writers, of course, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who I had known since we were both in Chile during Pinochet's time, writing. Oh, look, there is part of our dinner party. Good photo. Hillary Clinton, Carlos Fuentes, Bill Styron, Patricia Cepeda, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It turned out that this dinner party, which occurred because Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who I had known and been on platforms with in Mexico as well as other places, but hadn't seen for years, called and said, I hear that the Fuenteses are coming to visit you in 2 or 3 weeks. You always said I should come too. What do you think? And I said, of course, come. And he said, I'll let you know in a week or two if I can. Well, he turned up with Carlos 2 weeks after that. But the morning after that, and he had called me late at night, I was on a dune top on a beach with my tennis friends and Hillary Clinton, because the Clintons were visiting. And we heard a noise at this very private, quiet beach down below, and several Secret Service cars came with President Clinton, who had just finished golfing with Vernon Jordan, and said, where's my wife? Let's go find her. And so we came down, of course, and greeted him. And I won't go into the other things that happened, but he said to me early on, one of the reasons I came is that I heard Gabriel Garcia Marquez was coming to visit you. Of course, I'd only had a maybe 12 hours before, so I wondered how he knew that. But he said, please, if he comes, invite us to dinner. He's my daughter Chelsea's favorite author. So you would have thought that would have tipped me off that there might be something I didn't know about their coming. But Bill and I were too innocent and too happy as hosts, and having the Clintons and our Latin friends as guests, to understand that it wasn't just a lovely dinner party, which had many pieces to it, but that there was a big political agenda behind it, since the president of Mexico had been alerted both by Castro and Bill Clinton that things needed to be talked about and opened up to Cuba. And they decided that since Gabo was such a good friend of mine, that it would be fine if he and other writers came up to the vineyard and had conversations with President Clinton, which did go on at this very strange dinner party where Gabo kept asking President Clinton, who was sitting on my right, he was on my left, Gabo, and kept importuning him about Cuba until a friend changed the subject and said, why don't we just talk about what writers influenced us when we were young and made writers of us. So it went around the table, and it was quite interesting what these adult writers thought about their youthful inspiration. And it came around to the last person, President Clinton, who was on my right, and he pushed his chair back and he walked across our long dining table 3 or 4 times, reciting Benji's monologue from The Sound and the Fury, announcing, I'm a Southern boy, and so Faulkner was my influence. And at the end of this walking around, as we're about to have dinner, there's a call in the kitchen, on our phone in the kitchen, from Belfast, from Jerry Adams. And it was the first time that Clinton and Jerry Adams, head of Sinn Féin, had talked, and he was convinced, he said, to come to Ireland and try to further a peace treaty, which he did. And a month ago was the 25th anniversary of that peace treaty in Ireland. And of course, Bill Clinton was among the guests and the speakers, and he and Hillary were kind enough to come over and visit me on the vineyard for an hour. And we talked about that and other things. So that was my strange dinner party.
Well,
Which I have to say led to a dinner party which was equally bizarre in Havana, because President, whatever he was called, Comandante Castro, wanted to meet Bill, and we were all invited down there with Arthur Miller and others. So that was the second bizarre dinner party.
And all I was going to say is that sometimes a dinner party is a dinner party, and sometimes it's an international summit, but you don't know it. Nobody told you.
No, I didn't know either one of them was. And they both turned out to have consequences, which was fun.
Pretty significant. So we have spoken longer than well, I could go on all night, but just listening, but I do want to see if there's any questions. So Travis, I wonder, because I've been listening, I don't know how anybody can read questions while they're listening to something like this, but if there are any questions from our audience, it looks like there's a whole lot of compliments, which I will share with you, Rose and Gail, that I don't have to read them to you now. So I think that unless there's something you want to mention, either Jane Westman or
Well, I certainly like to mention Rose's book because I've read it, and it's just an amazing account of her career and the different causes that she supported, and an incredible schedule. I don't know how you ever kept up with it, of travel in the service of people who were in need of support on the world stage. And it was very moving to me and also quite exciting to read. And you portray some of the characters in it, who are, of course, real people, in such an animated way. You get a real sense of how they came together, how they socialized, and it's the kind of look at that kind of group of people, who many of whom are earth shakers, that you with an intimacy you don't normally have when you read about them. So I thought that was just a fascinating aspect of your book. It really humanized a lot of what goes on in these circles. And I thought that was extremely valuable, very, very interesting to me. And I appreciated it a lot. And also the fact that you handled dinners and get-togethers for all these people for so many decades is just astonishing. I don't know how you ever did it.
Well, thank you for appreciating it. If you live long enough and are lucky, lots of great things happen.
I guess so. Yes.
But friends are what are most important.
Yeah.
And every decade of one's life, and the fact that there are new ones still coming up makes the future look pretty swell.
Right. Well, you obviously have a great gift for friendship that just shines throughout the book.
Thank you.
and I have to thank both of you. Oh, sorry.
Fabulous. It's amazing.
So
About
I
run back an hour, but this has just been a fantastic conversation, and I really want to thank everybody for participating. And I hope everyone will go out and get copies of both of your books. I agree. Well, I haven't read Gail's book yet, obviously, but I can tell based on this conversation that I'm going to love it. And Rose, your book was amazing. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Remind
you.
everybody that gift season, amazingly, is almost upon us. So perfect timing. But yes, like Jane, I just want to thank Rose and Gail, who put a lot of time into organizing their thoughts to cut it down to just an hour and a half of these amazing lives. So thank you both, ladies, and I hope you have a relaxing evening ahead. But thank you so much for joining and spending your Tuesday night with us.
Thank you for inviting us.